Professor Peperzak holds the Arthur J. Schmidt Chair in Philosophy at Loyola University Chicago, where he has taught for some 23 years. Personally, I find it somewhat shocking to add up those years, since I arrived at Loyola as a young graduate student just 1 year after he joined the faculty. It doesn't feel like that long ago. His leadership as a distinguished citizen of the philosophical community, both in this country and in many other places throughout the world, is one of the reasons that we are able to be gathered here today, since he was a member of the founding executive board of the Society for Continental Philosophy and Theology, one of the sponsors of this conference. Professor Peperzak is well known for his writings on Hegel and Levinas. Those of us who have had the privilege to study with him or to know him as a colleague would be quick to testify that just as crucial to his philosophical imagination is his persistent engagement with Plato, Aristotle, Bonaventure, Descartes, and Heidegger, to mention a few. I use that word engagement intentionally. To learn philosophy with Adriaan Peperzak is to find oneself welcomed into the living presence of such classic thinkers, not only to appreciate them, and also not only to use them, but to think with them and to be transformed in the process. Whatever your philosophical background, orientation, and expertise, I expect that we will all be challenged through his commitment to dialogical thinking, to the friendly contention that binds together in kinship those who are the friends of truth, and his passionate devotion to holding together the profound depths of faith and the loftiest possible heights of thought. His address this afternoon is entitled Faith in Philosophy or Philosophy in Faith. Please join me in welcoming Professor Adriaan Peperzak.
Thank you very much, Aaron. What you did was what I wish we all could do, namely to sketch the ideal portrait of a philosopher. I will defend in my paper that it is time to write a phenomenology of the real philosopher, and I have not found so much about it. I cannot give it to you either today, but I can perhaps suggest a few aspects of it. So I'm really profoundly grateful for having been invited and for your coming. At the end of his third meditation on first philosophy, Descartes summarizes his argument for the existence of God and announces that he will investigate some of its consequences in the following meditations. However, conscious of having arrived halfway through his spiritual exercises of 6 days, he takes a break, which he justifies in the following words, I quote, "I would like to spend some time now on the contemplation of God's self, to dwell on his attributes, and to see, to admire, and to adore the beauty of his immense light, insofar as the accuracy of my mind is capable of it." Thus, the founder of modern philosophy followed the example of those medieval predecessors who, most often at the beginning of a new treatise, but often also at their end, or sometimes by way of interruption, connected their philosophical and theological analyses with prayers. Duns Scotus' treatise De Primo Principio, on the first principle, is a good example of such a procedure in the 13th century, as its exordium already demonstrates, and I quote again, the first sentences of this treatise. "May the first beginning of all that is real allow me to believe, to know, and to proclaim what pleases His Majesty, while it lifts our minds up to contemplation of Him. Lord our God, when Moses, your servant, asked you, the truest of all teachers, to let him know what he should tell the children of Israel, you, who know what the intellect of mortal beings can understand, have revealed your blessed name by answering him, I am who am. You are the true being, tu es verum esse. You are all being, tu es totum esse. This is, if it is possible for me at all, what I would like you to know. Help me, Lord, in my exploration of how much knowledge our natural reason can acquire, beginning with the being that you have predicated about yourself, about the true being that you are. End of the quote. In relation to Descartes' retrieval of his argument of the existence of God, Anselm's proslogion of the 11th century is even closer. The very succinct argument, 4 very short paragraphs, is there preceded by a quite long prayer, much longer than the proof, which many philosophers of our time tend to skip because they do not want to be distracted from their reflective task, their great philosophy, by prayers, faith, or piety. I do not know to what extent Descartes was aware of his fidelity to the very old Christian tradition of embedding philosophia, which until far into the 12th century encompassed what most of us now distinguish as philosophy and theology, in the outspoken practice of prayer and pious contemplation. But even when theologians like Aquinas did not mix reflection with prayer, he's a remarkable exception, the intimate links between them remained obvious in the texts those medieval thinkers developed. In the West, it is of course Augustine, who in his Confessions is the great and best known example of constantly interchanging prayer as speaking to God with instructive speaking about God. But the habit of such interchange is much older, as Clement, Origen, and the Cappadocians show, and it has been followed by innumerable Christian philosophers who, alas, are not counted between the most famous ones. It is difficult, however, to find similar examples in modern and postmodern philosophy, although a certain affinity between philosophy and some traces of pietas, or if you want, of another sort of faith, might be found in Spinoza, Leibniz, Malebranche, Kant, and Nietzsche. Even Hegel, who in his Phenomenology of Spirit banished piety from philosophy, remained until his death highly interested in the links between philosophy and theology, both of which he had studied in the Tübinger Stift, and on which he comes back in the last 10 years of his life, when he almost every year or every 2 years gives a course on philosophy of religion. Despite their emancipation from religious and political authorities, most modern philosophers from Descartes to Kant and Hegel have continued to see the connections between their philosophy and the Christian religion as a philosophical question of great importance, but their religious practices or theological convictions did no longer occupy the center of their search for truth. After Hegel, philosophy has been progressively allied with the sciences while loosening more and more its former ties with faith or theology. Instead of serving Christianity, which still kept its hold on the Western culture until the end of the 19th century, philosophy promoted itself as a general introduction to scientific thought, or as a super science of which the various sciences were branches insofar as they obeyed its universal logic and methodical devices. Links between philosophy and the question of God disappeared behind secular interests, whereas metaphysics and ontotheology became isolated, avoided, despised, and in any case left their own luck, which often was sought by outsiders who were not overly interested in receiving advice from contemporaneous philosophers. The actual situation in which faith and philosophy offer themselves to us is difficult to describe, and a not only complete but also detailed and accurate diagnosis of their relations surpasses my acquaintance with their latest developments. Many of us might have the impression that not only philosophy but also the culturally conditioned concretization of faith in modes of Christian theology have come to a point of exhaustion that forces us to a new beginning, which, of course, is not possible without a kind of radical revival of the best examples and traditions that time and again have refreshed our history. Dogmatic polemics have lost much of their favor, and theology seems to have withdrawn into specializations that are competing with other sciences, whereas philosophy has scattered into varieties that fight, ignore mostly, or misunderstand very often each other. How, in these circumstances, can we answer the most important questions that arise for us who are dedicated to thinking about the connections between faith and philosophy, and between both of them and Christian theology, which cannot be missed from a philosophically valid thinking related to faith? One possible answer would be that neither philosophy nor theology are necessary for all those who want to live a faithful life, and that we therefore should concentrate on the performance of such a life alone. While spending our intelligence and time on active participation in the professional societies to which we belong, and leaving the Christian faith to its own development, we could then wait for spontaneous outbursts of that faith, which understands itself in ever new ways according to the needs and gifts of time and culture. However, should such outbursts not be prepared and followed by some efforts within all the domains of our civilization, including all disciplines, where thinking must be learned before it yields acceptable practices and results? The question of how a Christian life should be lived by philosophers and theologians, as much as by all those who enter God's realm without sophisticated thoughts, we can be saved without philosophy, is easier to answer than the question of intelligent understanding, because the Gospels answer it with great simplicity and without ambiguity. The praxis in which our life, in all of its components, including our intellect, expresses its inspiration, has a double aspect: love God and love your neighbor. And these two aspects of love are one. But how does this one love, how does a heart that is not only touched but penetrated by faith express itself in the dimension of our human, personal, social, cultural, lingual, perceptive, affective, imaginative, conceptual, and, of course, also logical realizations? If love of God and all human persons without distinction is the supreme criterion for judging the faithfulness of our thought, how then should we, philosophers and theologians, behave and think, that is, receive, perceive, respond by appropriate descriptions, and by discovering the sense of all that surrounds us. Could we answer this question by the simple assurance that we will confront the question by entrusting it to the patterns and operations of today's philosophy? As it has grown up, can we confide this task to today's philosophy as it has grown up during almost 3 millennia? Or would we restrict philosophy to its modern and postmodern horizons and habits? Or, on the contrary, to a scholastic repetition of 1 or 2 medieval philosophies? Or could we jump back over more than 2 millennia of thinking in order to reconnect with pre-Christian or even with the pre-Platonic Greeks who stamped their mark on Western philosophy? These are questions that can be answered if you have a phenomenology of philosophy. But we haven't. I will leave all these and many other questions for later diagnoses of our epoch and use my 50 minutes for an extremely simplified question concerning some of the conditions that today make a philosophy compatible and welcoming, or, on the contrary, incompatible with our faith insofar as this seeks understanding of itself and of all that depends on it. I will do this by first giving you a rough sketch of a philosophical framework that, despite its extremely schematic, perhaps even somewhat caricatured aspects, I consider to underlie quite a number of contemporary philosophies, after which I then will ask whether, and if so, how we might try to amend such a framework in order to approach the life and thought of faith in a more appropriate way. Before I do this, just one precision about faith and another precision on philosophy. In this talk, I will not focus on the meaning of faith as believing that, followed by propositions or arguments. Instead, I use faith, fides, as the complete, that is, affective, practical, and knowledgeable acquaintance of the heart with God, who attracts and unites all willing hearts in Christ. Such a faith is alive when it permeates all the essential dimensions of a human life, including, of course, its thoughts and motivations. The second precision concerns my emphasis on philosophy. As I further on will defend that sufficient acquaintance with theology is required, not only for the clarification of faith, but also for an adequate understanding of the significance and the claims of philosophy in relation to faith, and therefore for all Christian philosophy, it should be clear that my focus on philosophy is motivated only by the temporal limitations of this talk, and secondarily by the fact that although I studied theology, most of my time has been spent on further study of philosophy. My ideal would be to use the inspiring word philosophia as a loving wisdom of wisdom's love in its ancient and medieval sense, which has perdured for more than 2,000 years, which refuses to be broken in 2 or more sciences because it loves the one truth with many faces. Let me then try to give you this rough and simplified sketch of a framework that seems to underlie many introductions, courses, books, and textbooks of philosophy. And here I make myself vulnerable to your criticisms, of course. In my attempt to emphasize some characteristic features, such a sketch easily becomes a caricature. Insofar as this might here be the case, I apologize for it, but I hope that it still may serve as a perhaps somewhat exaggerated foil for discussing some tendencies of philosophy that have become favorite in modernity and are still doing in our time. As a kind of fundamental pre- or super science, philosophy has a universal content. Since its beginning in Greece, Western philosophy needed a panoramic view in order to seek the truth about all realities that are given to human beings who want to understand what and how they are, whether they are such as they seem to be, how they are linked to the world and to one another, forming relations and ensembles, why they exist at all, and what their meaning is. What is the truth of all these realities and of the whole that they together compose in history, that is, in past and future time? Our philosophical traditions begin with Parmenides, who replaced not only mythical genealogies, but also the quasi-empiricist attempts of the physiologians with the question of being, einai, esse. His own answer to the question was that being must be understood as principle of all beings, ta panta, which together form one whole, to pan, the universe. The long adventure of European philosophy thus began as an all-encompassing ontology, which, through all its versions and transformations, led to the summits of modern philosophy as symbolized by Spinoza's and Hegel's all-round systematic systems. If we may read the history of European philosophy from Parmenides to Hegel as one coherent process, as Hegel did, and as we shouldn't do, it is very attractive to state that this process developed itself within the horizon of one all, to hen kai pan, sort of shibboleth for Lessing, which was taken over by the young idealists, Schelling, Hegel, and the poet Hölderlin. So that was about the content. The typically modern philosopher declared himself emancipated from all authorities. That's the second characteristic. He claimed that his philosophy, as separated from all faith and theology, emerged from an as yet uncommitted and purely rational intellect that was confided to his independent care. The philosopher was thus alone with himself and the universe, which had to be displayed in front of his and his readers' searching observation in order to conceptually transform what he had observed into the truth of a clear and orderly composed universe. To reach this truth, the philosopher was alone because he despised all authorities except his own intellect. But he felt supported by faith in reason, as Hegel called it, when he recommended this type of faith to his students as the only power they should trust when practicing philosophy. Imagine he gives his first class with a little preface to the students of Berlin, and it says, you don't have to presuppose anything, only one thing, and that is essential, have faith in reason. Okay. Third point. From Parmenides to Hegel, it has been clear that the content about which a philosopher must think is unlimited. The content of philosophy is, as they say, all things, ta panta, and their belonging together forms one whole. The perspective a philosopher must adopt is therefore as wide as all that is. It is a panoramic view, as I already said. In order to observe and maintain this as such, I need a place from where I can oversee the universe. But a panoramic view presupposes a distance from which the philosopher can perceive and observe the all before he thinks about its composition in order to formulate its truth in a logical language that procures insight to himself and everyone else. After a naive phase of perception, I approach a wealth of phenomena which I then treat as objects, that is, as entities that lie there in front of me or emerge out of their context, which I can look at before and over against me, so that I can find a method to grasp them, to order them, to display and inspect every phenomenon, person, event, or story, including myself, my I, and my own life and philosophy. I am the great spectator, and that gives, of course, a very nice feeling of power. The whole of all things parade before my mental eye, my ego, in order to be captured and possessed by me, so that I can analyze and synthesize them in the form of concepts, propositions, statements, systematic patterns, and networks of patterns. Obviously, the philosopher who has found an Archimedean site from where he can deconstruct and reconstruct the universe feels like God. But going down to life, where he must pay his bills and needs a bath, is humiliating. Fourth point, instead of talking about being and the omnitudo of all beings made possible by being, as Parmenides did, many modern philosophers and many professors of our own epoch, and even very famous writers, prefer to speak of things, which then are often treated as almost empty shells that can be filled with the help of various specifications. Some things happen to be human persons. Other things are trees or dogs. Again, other things happen to be angels or gods, novels or sacred texts, poems or matches or whatever else. Of course, much more would have to be said if we wanted to characterize a more accurate paradigm of the average philosophical scene as it should be described today. But perhaps the bare mention of the solitary, anti-authoritarian, or even autarkic, panoramic, objectifying, and theological aspects of much current philosophy is already sufficient to justify a certain, albeit tentative and provisional agreement on the basic setup of the philosophical theater in which we perform our profession. However, at least one more precision is especially relevant for us if we want to answer the question of which philosophies are compatible or incompatible with a philosopher's attachment to Christian faith. From the standpoint of a fully autochthonous philosophy, the question would be, does Christian faith in God fit the horizons of the philosophical framework I sketched? From the perspective of faith, however, we would ask, does this type of philosophy fit into the parameters of a Christian's self-aware faith in God, who integrated humanity together with its universe into his own life? Does the widely shared trust of many professors, students, and departments of philosophy in the specific type of philosophy just evoked also permit us, Christian philosophers, to accept it as our point of departure or even as a permanent horizon for our search of an appropriate blend of Christian faith and philosophy? Or would at least some elements of this framework need a thorough overhaul in order to fit the context of a life that is lived and thought in faith? Before we try to answer the latter question, I would like to insert a remark on the relations between philosophy and theology as practiced by Christian thinkers, insofar as both are then related to faith. Having already expressed my skepticism with regard to the possibility of cleanly separating both disciplines by a clear-cut boundary, I want to stress once more that philosophy and theology are not two self-enclosed constructions that can be finished without interaction. One way of separating philosophy from theology has consisted in the attempt to schedule the program of philosophy as an independent reconstruction of the universe by what they call natural reason, on top of which then a theological superstructure could be built. Would it really be possible to build such a second floor of our building without recourse to thoughts and structures that need the best thinking of those philosophers who have at least an inkling of the theological questions that must be integrated from a different perspective than the one that dominates a pagan atheist, or, if that is possible, a neutral, or as some optimists have said, natural philosophy? And where exactly lies the border between a natural and a grace-given reasonability? If God's revelation and gracious providence are not reserved to an exclusive elite, but instead for all who are seeking God. That is, for all who are human, at least a little bit. Without engaging at this occasion in a discussion, which would of course take a lot of time, about the relations that keep nature and grace distinct and together, I only want here to state the thesis, or if you prefer, the presupposition, that no philosophy can be called Christian in any sense if it does not in any way anticipate, prepare, prefigure certain seeds or elements that receive their full meaning only in a startling theology. I remind you of the logoi spermatikoi about which the fathers talk so often. A wholly profane, a wholly secular, or as some say, a theological philosophy would be too inhospitable with regard to the healing and uplifting transfiguration that it would receive from grace. Such a self-imprisoned philosophy is not even a very good philosophy, because it answers the overwhelming facts and phenomena of religion and its counterfeits by ignoring or downplaying them as senseless or primitive. And ignorance is not something we should recommend to philosophers. A philosopher who is enclosed within the horizon of the universe cannot find a place for God, because God does not have a place within the panorama of his investigation. He cannot be hospitable to the God who transcends everything, and certainly a place within the universe. And certainly not the God who reveals himself by stating, I am, addressing us thereby as the you for whom he cares. Instead of a series of predicates, the added, all-surpassing and mysterious who I am comes from beyond the greater than great circle of any determinable, even formally determinable universe. And this remains true when Jesus presents himself equally as I am, as John chapter 8 repeats. I am of Jesus, who, according to the book of Revelation, is the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. The being from which philosophy should take its flight, if it wants to become part of a theological answer to God's self-presentation, from Abraham, Moses, and Jesus to our time, The absolutely originary and conclusive meaning of being, I am, is revealed to us in that presentation. I am as coming close and being present to you. Like someone's greeting that prompts us to a response, God's awe-awakening I am inspires us to our echoing answer, here I am. Read 1 Samuel. Here we are, who have been touched, caught, wounded, returned, converted. The horizon has changed. The universe has been restored and transformed into a dialogue with God. If the being of God's and Christ's I am, as answered by our here I am, if that is the initial event that determines the original and ultimate horizon within which our human lives evolves, then the point of departure of any ontotheology and of the philosophy that such a theology implies changes from a network of things into the drama of a meta-universal dialogue and love relationship between God and humans. The always already arrived, past, present, and imminent proximity of God's presence, as guiding cloud by day and as obscurity of a most mysterious light at night, ruptures then the limit of every and all universes and universals in order to infinitely surpass and permeate all particular and exceptional interactions, not only between singularly unique persons, stories, and conversations, but also between individually existing animals, trees, plants, situations, houses, and workplaces, including also innumerable things, tools, and works of art. In an endless multiplicity of innumerable modes and styles of being, the entire wealth of the creation will then be experienced as the proximity of God, who is in all beings and in their ways of dealing with one another, but also as the one unique God who hiddenly lives and to some extent appears in all natural and historical realities. As a personal invasion, presence is at once an invitation to respond by allegiance and participation in God's caring for all creating being, to begin with humanity's manifold I am, and here we are, in the singular and together. As far as I can see, Emmanuel Levinas is the first philosopher who has pleaded for a basic decision through which philosophers would honor the absolute and infinite significance of each singular human. Each singular human other in the first place as central to all truth and philosophy. He thus gave us a 20th century philosophical version of the one supreme commandment that Jesus inculcated upon his disciples. Love one another as I have loved you. And what you have done for the least of my people, you have done for me. It is probably true that 2,000 years of learned reflection performed by Christian philosophers and theologians have not reflected enough about the supreme relevance and all its consequences for their ontologies of this always new commandment, which should distinguish all seekers of God, not only in their practices, but also in all versions of their theory. Popular customs and stories in Christianity, however, have always shown a lively understanding of the truth that being faced or visited by a needy, poor, miserable, or desperate person is a summons by God, whose face hides and appears in all human others who are facing me. The challenge of God's I am to us in Christ and in all other human images of God shows not only who and how God is, but also what kind of responsibility and love each of us must embrace with regard to all humans. And if I may add this remark, which you don't find in Levinas, I believe, then that challenge of God to us to see him as the face, in the face of each other, that challenge includes also our own singular self that inhabits us, because my own self, like the self of all others, is created in reverable dignity. If God's care for humanity may be understood as a hidden presence that implies its own past and future, the closed universe of the lonely philosophers' panoramic and objectifying logic of things is broken up, because it is lifted up and opened onto the infinite transcendence of God's self, who is without restrictions, without clear and distinct concepts, and thus shines in an absolutely incomparable, uncomposed, uncomplicated, not only unspatial and transtemporal, but infinitely simple and even conceptually totally ungraspable way. The closed circle of the universe cannot be considered to enclose and measure the domain of philosophy, and certainly not of theology. Fortunately, the greatest classics of philosophy have not allowed their intellect to be imprisoned within the finite borders of any universe, not even of the universe of all universes. The Platonic and Neoplatonic tradition about the good beyond being, for example, has helped the early and medieval theologians to think beyond the ultimate borders of any all. Plato's attempt to reach out to that which transcends and precedes all essences by giving them their being, while granting to our intellect the light that unveils their truth, has been followed by Aristotle, although people refuse to quote where he says that. They have been followed not only by Aristotle, but of course even more so by Plotinus and many other thinkers of European philosophy and theology, at least until Cusanus, but as we have seen, even by Descartes. To name the secret beyond all secrets, which never can be recognized as a definable essence or substance, and certainly not as a thing or object, or as any one of the multiple beings that compose our universe, not even the greatest one. Plato proposed various names for that secret, but the good, to agathon, which Socrates with much hesitation mentions, and the beauty itself, preferred by the priestess Diotima, seem rather appropriate insofar as we can reach out to it, if at least they can be thought, or at least meant, without reducing their meaning to any ousia, idea, essence, being, object, or, God forbid, thing. If we want to replace or surpass the essential and universalist framework of modern philosophy, however, by opening a trans or super horizon that permits us to transcend the limits of all universes, how then is it still possible to speak about God at all in a more or less logical and not quite arbitrary way? If we do not have access to God through an immediate experience or mental vision of the infinite God beyond all being, Aren't we condemned to limit God's own essence, that is, the being of God's I am, by using words and forming concepts of finite realities of which we do possess immediate experiences, finite concepts or logical structures? But are we then wholly incapable of speaking at all about God in more or less appropriate language, if it is indeed completely impossible to conceive of God as somehow comparable to and connected with, empirically given or logically distinct and somehow definable or indicatable beings? Two answers in combination with one another seem to me necessary and helpful, even if in the end we must recognize that all our speaking about God cannot overcome the level of stammering hints and some kind of arrows that point to the darkest, though most glorious mystery that grants essence and meaning to the existence of creation. The first answer concerns the Platonic desire and drive, or eros, that propulses all that is human in us, the most profound pathos, which Origen and Augustine and so many other Christians have reinterpreted as integrated into the Spirit's love of God in us, who has created the human spirit and its way of being. The upward movement of our human essence is then understood as our God-willed longing for the one who surpasses all finite ends and kinds of lovability. In a Christian context, the basis and original love of the Spirit in us drives ourself at the same time into and out of all our finite satisfactions, because they are not absolutely good and beautiful, and therefore essentially disappointing, despite the many forms of happiness, delight, nobility, and elevation we experience in them. God's self cannot be found on the highest level of a ladder that reaches to heaven. He is not the greatest, because God is absolute, not the greatest, and infinite, not bigger than everything else. And consequently, he is incomparable to anything else, because that else would only be a limited and finite good, and therefore not the answer to the infinite depth of what many writers call the human heart. In accordance with the all-surpassing incomparability of the absolutely desirable, those writers describe the heart then as the deepest and therefore empty longing that precedes and reaches out toward all forms of reason and rationality, insofar as these imply familiarity with more or less clear and distinct networks of reasoning and argumentation. The pathos that drives us reaches out beyond the universe, because only the ultimate unicity, without comparability, can still the human heart and provide us with a guidance that allow us to recognize the direction of a meaningful thinking that seconds the faith in which our longing is concretized. To become really one with the love through which the beloved has always already begun to return us to our truest end and beginning, we must become acquainted with the length, the breadth, the height, and the depth of the heart that follows the orientation by which it, not through a decision of human will, but by the earlier energy of incomparable love, is motivated. However, it seems true that dropping all words and concepts that point to finite realities while referring to God would make us not only speechless, but also unable to silently communicate with the God in which everything begins and ends. Among human interlocutors, the vocative has a primary role. This is my second answer. I make more often contact with others by directing a name to someone than by any form of explanation. I don't have to explain who you are before I can say hello. Hello is enough, or just a wink of my eye is enough to address you or awaken your attention. If God surpasses our finite universe, including all languages that are structured according to some logic of finite characterizations and relations, can we then not alert, affect, touch, contact, or reach God at all? As I said before, the faith I presuppose is not a theoretical, propositional, dogmatic belief that something is true. It has to be practiced in the first place, and that might be already enough. But if we want to speak to God, the speaking about God won't do. A nice, beautiful, the best, the brilliant, the final theology doesn't speak to God. It speaks to other human beings. That communication with God, and even an appropriate mode of theological explanation, are hardly possible without any tie to prayer, was presupposed in the text with which we started. If we may see a kind of parallel between our communication with other humans and our listening or responding to God, we cannot be too surprised if some theologian would assure us that we can enter into conversation with God by desiring, invoking, reaching out, and contacting God without first studying who and how God is. It is quite well known from the abundant literature about varieties of religious experience that learned treatises and sophisticated meditations progressively melt into insights and unifying experiences of the heart that deepen while simplifying the religious meaning of the preceding considerations. The naked immediacy of a vocative in faith that lives on loving gratitude and hope may replace all speculation because it presents and represents much better the one truly essential relation than any form of reflection. By invocating God in response to God's alerting call, one has already found an at least somewhat appropriate attitude and stance and a promising direction for finding God, directing all attention to the originary and without being distracted by highly interesting problems that distract from pious concentration is an extremely simplified keeping in touch which, even without any dogmatic expertise or onto-theological involvement, is a perfect style of responding to the one who is always the first. Should I shorten my paper a bit? The answer that I in the end give is very simple. If we can say to you, my spouse, my friend, my beloved, my colleague, my student, without telling my beloved, my spouse, my student, my colleague, who they are, then that might be an image of our reaching out to God without much explanation. The explanations that we then need are earthly realities that are created in God's image. The first image is, of course, Jesus Christ, in which God presents God as facing human, a facing human that is among us all the time in the facing humans that we meet and that apparently are meant for us. There's so many others whom we will not meet. Of course, the same godly truth is true of them, but I thank God that I don't have to help 1,000,000 people, but the 10 people or 20 or 30 or 40 that I meet are already God's presence, and it is more than enough. I want to finish by saying, if it is true that God reveals himself in I am, and you will discover who I am. And if our answer is, here I am also, and everyone gives that same answer to you, and your am is compassionate and preventing us by grace and embracing us in grace, then if we spend a life on learning how to embrace God in our neighbor, that dispenses us from a lot of theology and philosophy. But don't give it up, because the message has to be given through our professions. Either you're a doctor or a nurse, or as we are more or less trying to be philosophers. Okay, so in that dimension of the reality also God has to be present. Everything becomes metaphor. What is a metaphor? Of course, we could discuss very long time. There's not so much that I found about metaphor, and that really gives an answer. Two things are clear. Metaphors are earthly realities. Even if we use all sort of beautiful, elevated predicates about God, it is in fact speaking about the earth, but not as the end point, not as the universe that we are going to glorify. It is the universe in which God passes for us and passes to us in a sort of shady form of God's self. And the proof is in Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the first metaphor, but we can recognize Jesus Christ in all other metaphors. As, for instance, in Francis does when he sings his cantico about brother, sun, sister, water, etc. Not only nature, but also history, but that is much more mysterious, presents us with God. Let me read my last page. Then at least I have the satisfaction of reading what I wanted to put at the end. When we teach philosophy or theology to our students, we talk at the same time to them and about all that interests them about God and the universe to which they and all others belong. We thus speak to them about themselves, God and all other persons, and sometimes, at least implicitly, about ourselves. It is therefore not only possible, but almost inevitable for a teacher of philosophia to combine speaking to and speaking about one's students. If the students respond, the lecture has the form of a dialogue. Our predecessors in Christian philosophia wanted to connect their speaking about God so intimately with their speaking to God that the music of their prayers not only introduced, interrupted, and concluded, but also continued during their more prosaic explications. Some medieval manuscripts come close to an ideal union of speaking to and speaking about by reproducing on their pages a fragment of God's word in the center, while surrounding it, that word of God, in response to that word, with a human commentary that clarifies that life-giving word by constantly referring to its illuminating fecundity. Will we be or become able to respond by such commentaries in a comparable way of our own to the Word of God?